Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking a completely impartial, but honestly super fascinating dive into a highly provocative vision. It's really important to note right off the bat that all the concepts, the predictions, literally everything we're exploring today comes straight from the writings of Life Shan founder Xu Feng. We're going to unpack his radical prediction, the absolute, imminent disappearance of nations. We're breaking down his exact arguments, his timelines, and his survival strategies. So let's just jump right in, shall we?
Think about this for a second. Are you a citizen of your country, or are you a citizen of the Earth? Now, according to Xu Feng, if you answered my country, you're actually relying on an entirely obsolete concept. He argues that this deeply ingrained allegiance we all have to borders and flags isn't just outdated, it's a mindset that is rapidly actively dying out. Which brings us to our first section, the radical thesis, the end of nations and traditional marriage. So Xu Feng argues that the traditional structures of both nation-states and marriages aren't just flawed, they are actively dying out as a natural law of civilizational evolution. And to really drive this home, he uses this incredibly vivid analogy. He writes, marriage and family, just like the foot binding of women in the Southern Song dynasty, will inevitably be regarded as a symbol of backwardness and ignorance. Wow, right? He basically predicts that in just 20 to 30 years, future generations are going to look back at marriage and, by extension, the whole concept of the nation-state and find them utterly ridiculous, exactly the way we look at foot binding today.
Now, to really understand his perspective, you have to look at how Xu Feng separates two concepts that we usually just mix together, the homeland versus the state. He posits that loving your ancestral homeland, your roots, your culture, that's a purely emotional connection and totally valid. But loving the state? He says that is a grave mistake. He defines the state as an inherently violent machine. In his view, a nation-state is essentially a prison that literally kidnaps its own people. He sees it as a massive restriction on human potential and the absolute root cause of military conflict and ecological destruction.
And to back this up, he actually points to historical precedent. Think about ancient China during the Warring States period, right? It was divided up into Qi, Chu, Yan, and so on, but eventually, those states dissolved into one unified region. And Xu Feng asks, isn't that a good thing? I mean, imagine if you still needed to get a visa just to travel between different provinces in China today. It would be crazy. He argues that the collapse of all modern nations would actually be this massive welfare gain for ordinary people, finally allowing the free, totally unhindered flow of humanity across the entire globe.
Okay, let's dive into this next part. Section 2. Engines of Collapse. 8 catalysts replacing the state.
The states are really going to collapse. What exactly does Xu Feng predict is going to step up and replace them? Well, he outlined some very specific catalysts where the old way of doing things is already being completely bypassed. For instance, traditional global governance, that's being superseded by digital communities like Facebook. The massive state-funded space exploration of the 20th century being totally outpaced by private companies like SpaceX. And local government administration, he points out that's being replaced by grassroots initiatives like Michael Tellinger's Ubuntu movement and over 1,000 intentional eco-villages that are designed to manage their own food, health, and living standards completely without government interference.
Just take Facebook as an example. Look at this staggering number, 2 billion. That was their user base around the time of his writing. Xu Feng views this massive, interconnected network as basically an invisible superpower. His point is, if a global community can coordinate their thinking and their actions on a single platform like this, the physical borders and the traditional functions of existing nation-states are gradually going to become virtually useless. They're effectively building a global government right under our noses.
And then, in the realm of space exploration, Xu Feng points to February 7th, 2018. That's when the private company SpaceX launched the Falcon Heavy rocket. He uses this specific event to emphasize a really crucial point. Here you have a single private enterprise demonstrating technological and logistical capabilities that far exceed those of massive nations like the US, Russia, or China. His argument is that if thousands of super private enterprises like this emerge, we simply don't need nation-states anymore to solve massive global challenges.
And, of course, then there's the ultimate curveball. Artificial intelligence. Xu Feng cites a fascinating statistic from Stanford professor Kaplan. 47% of U.S. jobs and potentially over 70% of Chinese jobs could be completely replaced by AI. Xu Feng notes that AI, like AlphaGo, hasn't just beaten humans. It's evolving geometrically into what he calls super biological robots. And he predicts that when that really takes hold, the intellectual gap between AI and humans is going to be so incredibly vast that the traditional concept of a nation will just be swept straight into the Museum of History. So when does all this go down? That brings us to Section 3, a prophetic timeline, 2018 to 2048.
Zhu Feng outlines this highly specific, frankly chaotic 30-year roadmap. He says 2018 marked the beginning of a purification era, kicking off a decade of severe, unimaginable climate disasters and massive refugee crises. Then, moving into 2028, he predicts humanity will enter a decade of ruthless, unrestrained struggles just for basic survival resources. This all culminates in 2038, which he marks as the absolute peak of human-made disasters and conflict. But then finally, by 2048, the chaos subsides. Why? Because according to him, the global population will have drastically reduced, and from those ashes, a depopulated, stateless, and harmonious utopia is finally born.
Okay, so the crucial point is, what does Zhu Feng advise you to do right now to prepare? Let's look at Section 4, your survival blueprint, navigating the collapse.
If you accept his premise that the state is collapsing into decades of chaos, how exactly do you protect yourself? Well, Zhu Feng lays out some very specific, urgent directives. First off, he says you need to imagine the state is already gone and literally stop working for it immediately. You need to shift your identity entirely to being an Earth citizen. He urges people to join alternative networks right now, things like Facebook, the Ubuntu movement, or those self-sustaining eco-villages we mentioned. You also need to physically escape densely populated, unjust places where resources are going to be strained. And finally, he says you need to adopt this ancient preparedness mindset. Dig deep holes, accumulate grain. To truly understand his absolute rejection of relying on the state, check out this striking quote. He says, "Everything you do for the country will be like a blind person lighting a lamp, a waste of wax. Relying on the government is worse than raising pigs." I mean, wow, that is incredibly blunt, right? He is explicitly telling his followers that national affairs are completely irrelevant, that government promises are just lies, and that tying your personal survival to the fate of a nation-state is literally the most dangerous thing you could possibly do.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today. And I really want to leave you with this final, provocative question inspired by Zhu Feng's survival blueprint. If all nations actually disappear tomorrow, if the borders, the governments, and all those safety nets just vanish into thin air, how will you survive? Whether you agree with his 30-year timeline or his apocalyptic warnings, Zhu Feng's framework really forces us to deeply ponder our own reliance on the nation-state in an era of such rapid, unpredictable change. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.